Hello, Hoovians, and welcome back to the third channel. Hooray! Another interview. Dun dun dun. I'm going through interviews like I'm going through hot dinners. Eating one every night, not eating the interview, obviously. So, if you remember the last interview with the glorious Blue Peter presenter, Abby Cook. Now, we move on to more amazing interviews. It starts off in the beginning of the year and it gets higher and higher and higher as the year goes on. Woohoo! Now, the other bit of admin is as of Thursday, because today is Saturday the 14th of October, I have now created my 20th YouTube channel. Here's one I made earlier, a Blue Peter based YouTube channel. I will be uploading highlights from my Richard Marston interview and highlights from my Abby Cook interview where the information is relevant to the video I am making. Hooray for context! So, we shall crack on with my very special guest. He is best known for the Don't Slam a 2.4 Children podcast and the relatively recent The British Empire podcast. It's one and only John David Colins.
Hello. Hello, Tom. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to speak to you again.
And so we'll start at the very beginning of your journey. When did you first watch 2.4 Children?
Gosh, it would be going back about 20 odd years. I remember watching it as a very young child, from probably somewhere between 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old on UK Gold. Not really understanding it because I think when you're that age, you don't fully understand all the jokes and necessarily the story, but you like the characters and the world and the way it looks. It was very enticing as a young kid, just watching something that really just seemed so comforting to me. I then rediscovered it properly when I was 16. They hadn't repeated it on Gold for quite a number of years. And for a long time, they only showed the first four series because of music right issues. And then in 2011 and 2012, they put all 8 series on Gold. And it was like watching it all for the first time. It was around the time I was enjoying comedy and I was starting to realize that my style and humor that I enjoyed the most was sort of surreal, dark humor, and I love pathos in comedy. And also with that realism, which 2.4 Children just mixes all those elements together beautifully.
And why do you think that 2.4 Children, after so many years, is still so popular?
Well, I think the thing about the show was, it was a big hit when it was on TV. I think people forget that it was in its peak a massive ratings winner. I mean, I'm writing a book about the making of the show now, and I've seen all the ratings, and it was consistent. I mean, it peaked mainly in the middle sort of few years, and 14 million was the most watched biggest viewing figure. But then, as long run shows do, they sometimes dip a bit, but it never went lower than 6, 7 million, even by the late 90s when digital and more options were there. So the show was a consistent winner. I think, firstly, I think that the writing is just so beautiful because it's known for the surreal elements. But I think one of the things that I really resonate with, it resonates to me now more so, is the realism.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people often say that the show was a precursor to the sitcom My Family, which did come along very shortly after 2.4 Children ended. Personally, I would say it actually may not have been credited as being influential by maybe the people who made it, but I think it was a precursor to things like The Royal Family and Outnumbered. Now, I know those other two shows are single camera, so there is that more naturalism in the performances, where studio sitcoms naturally, by their nature, are working towards an audience. But I think that the Porter family and 2.4 Children are so believable in the more real moments of the series, away from the sort of surreal elements, that I think they have a believability that very few other family sitcoms before and since then has achieved. And I think the show has a quality about it, that the surreal and parodies and musical numbers, that makes it just really entertaining.
Yeah.
And I think it's a show that those of us who love it absolutely worship it in the nicest possible way, because it's just such a comforting show. and it doesn't play to the lowest common denominator. It's intelligent. It has something for everybody. I've watched it at all ages and got something different out of it each time. And I just think it's so underrated. And as well, because it's been so hard to watch over the years, its availability or chance to watch has been so sporadic that a lot of us have to keep it going. On Facebook, we've got a great Facebook page run by a lovely guy called David. Shout out to David Colin. Thank you for doing that, a DVD campaign page, which has become the Facebook sort of fan page for 2.4 Children. I just think it's a great piece of work and deserves as many people to see it as possible.
Yeah. And how did you end up coming about to take it upon yourself to create the one and the only, to my knowledge, 2.4 children based podcast?
So I had always wanted to, well, all I wanted for many years, it's sort of the 2010s, from when I say I was 16 in the early 2011. From then on, I was so frustrated by how little discussion there was about 2.4 children. And the main thing I wanted was a book. That was the thing I wanted. I always watched 2.4 children and thought, there's a great book in this.
Yeah.
I want to find out where the plots ideas came from. I want to find out behind how they achieve certain scenes behind the scenes. For example, there's a great episode where the main character Bill, her friend Rona, and the auntie of Bill called Belle are stuck on a window ledge on a tower block, and it's incredibly impressive. I mean, it was an episode that was really debuted in 1996, and it still looks incredibly convincing. And I've learned that it was done in a studio. It was, and the way it was done was really, really clever. And so I always knew there was a book in it. Then in 2019 and 2020, I started writing a book.
Yeah.
And then around August 2020, I came across a number of podcasts that were centered around certain sitcoms. And one of them was the One Foot in the Grave podcast. Shout out to my friend Tom. And there was discussion about 2.4 children on Twitter. I think it had been repeated that time. And I got in touch with him to sort of say, how do you do podcasting? And he gave me all the behind the scenes of how it's done. And it made me, I don't know, there was a moment, an epiphany moment where I thought, I want the book as the end game. But if I do a podcast where I am able to critically review every episode, maybe get to know Andrew Marshall, who wrote the series, and see if he wants to be involved in interviews, what I was thinking originally. And the cast and crew, maybe over the time, I could build up this knowledge of 2.4 and attach myself to it, that I will be able to sort of use that as a way of saying, actually, I know a lot about it, I can write the book. And how it came about was quite, in a way, it was like a grand plan to a certain extent. And it's sort of working out that way. But what happened with the podcast was I met the most incredible people, like yourself and some people who don't do podcasts or who are in other creative ventures, that have become my friends. And we've formed a community. And it's been such an incredible project to answer your question for how it started. That's the long answer.
Yeah. And how did you end up coming about, end up talking to the creator of 2.4 children?
So what happened was in November 2020, I started the social media page for the podcast. And I just wanted to build up a bit of a following, say I'm going to do it in the new year and try and maybe see what the general response was. So on Twitter, I did it on Twitter and Instagram. So I basically followed all the cast and crew that I could find on those social media platforms. And as I say, my hope would be maybe getting Andrew and the others on for interviews episodes. And then eventually maybe it would jump to actually I'm going to write a book and then maybe have more discussions. I mean, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but actually he got in touch with me and we had a bit of a chat and he through private message. And then he asked, would I be interested in recorded memories for every episode, which was just the most incredible thing. I mean, firstly, how generous of him to do that, but also it kind of gave me a kickstart for the book because I suddenly, as the episode memories kept coming, I was like, oh, it's a lot of stuff here. And so it was the basis for
Yeah,
expanding my knowledge of the behind the scenes, which I'm now doing with the book.
yeah. And are you going to keep the same branding for the book as you did with the podcast?
No, so the book's quite different, and I'm really glad how it's all come about quite naturally. Now, the book originally was kind of more like an essay book, and it was going to explore all the themes of the series and ideas. I might write that one day, but actually, what was great about the podcast was it was the first time that the show had ever. I mean, I don't want to be sort of arrogant to say it's the first time, but it kind of was the first time that the show had a proper critical dissection about the elements, the themes, and to really get across to people. Because I think there is, although I say it has its fans, and as I've learned, it did have critics who championed it, a lot of comedy critics, because it seems to be the way, don't like family sitcoms.
Yeah,
And I think a lot of critics, especially modern critics who may have watched it at the time or hadn't watched it properly, totally got it wrong. And I think it needed that critical reanalysis. In fact, a few years ago, do you remember BBC Store that
yeah,
was on? It was the thing that you could buy. It was like Amazon Prime, but
yeah,
there was a BBC equivalent. Well, I remember when that sort of started. It only lasted a few years. The British Comedy Guide put an article of listing shows that they wanted to see put on there, and there was things like That Was the Week That Was and Sykes, things that hadn't been on DVD at that point. And one of them was 2.4 Children. And the thing that they said was, often derided as a middle class, run of the mill sitcom. This was a show that had X, Y, and Z themes. It's overdue a reassessment. And that's what I felt it needed. With the book, it's more to do, yes, it's to do with the elements, but it's more about the behind the scenes
yeah,
of how they made the show, and where ideas came from. It's sort of expanding on the memories and some of the cast interviews I've released on the podcast to really give the definitive story about 2.4 Children and how the show came about, how it was made, but putting forward why it deserves a better analysis.
yeah. And not only have you done a 2.4 Children podcast, you've now also done a successor to a sitcom that's probably less well known than 2.4 Children. How did the idea of a British Empire podcast come about?
Well, I'm not. I've got to be honest. I don't think it's possibly less well known than 2.5. I think it's probably just as well known in the sense that it was on the same. They first started the same year. So January was 91 was when British was on, and 2.4 started in September. I think they're both shows that are very popular. They were popular at the time. They've got their fans. They both haven't had the support, I think, to become repeated. They wasn't repeated compared to other shows of the same era, like Fools and Horses. I think that they're more cult shows, which is not a bad thing. Cult TV is I think if you get called a cult show, I think that's the best label that you can get. Um, what happened was I co-hosted with a guy called Chris Nichols, who was on the 2.4 Children podcast. He also co-runs the Facebook page, the 2.4 Children Facebook page. So we obviously I recorded episodes with him, so we got chatting and then we became good friends. And he absolutely loves the British Empire, which I've seen a lot of. I remember watching certain episodes when I was younger, but I've not seen it as much as him. And so he said he wanted to do a British Empire podcast. And around sort of the end of last year, he said, "Can you help do some recordings, just some test recordings to see how I do it?"
Yeah,
And so he was going to do it a bit like I'd done 2.4 Children, where every week it would be a different guest or maybe a returning guest to review a certain episode. And I was watching these episodes of British Empire that we were going to do a test recording on, and I remember thinking, to do this because it's so brilliantly written and produced, like 2.4, in the sense that both shows are very similar in that they are very similar to other type of sitcoms. So obviously 2.1 is a domestic sitcom. There's lots of family sitcoms. British Empire, it's got the workplace setting and staff members, so that harbors back to things like Faulty Towers, Are You Being Served, Heidi High. But both of them had an irreverent humor to them that seems to be very much part of that early 90s culture. and in my opinion, escal enhanced the quality of mainstream sitcoms in that time. They weren't bland, as people might misremember them as, and they actually had a lot more depth than people either remember or choose to remember, because I think some people just choose to be negative about a lot of these kind of comedies. And so we started recording these episodes and we put them out, and we've had some great feedback. And we've done the first two series. We're going to do the third series soon, record them. And it's just, again, another great fan base that we've got involved with. And everyone's so friendly and enthusiastic and passionate. So it's I've been very, very lucky with my podcasting experience.
And have you got any plans to make any more sitcom based or any other type of podcasts?
I have ideas, I just don't have time. That's the problem. I'm currently we say we're recording this on the 14th of October. I'm currently in the middle of a house move and quite a few things. I have a full-time job. I'm very, very busy doing living, but the main priority now is the 2.4 book.
Yeah.
And then we'll be back to the British Empire podcast. I'd like to do more 2.4 children podcast episodes, but that might not be for some time because I need to. I've done all the series now, so it's all sort of all I needed to sort of do in a way. But obviously, I want to create more episodes and themed episodes and maybe a quiz mini series. So I will be back with them. It's just at the moment I'm just having to take a breather.
Yeah. And with the amount of people that were that are into sitcoms, do you reckon that it'll be easy to get the cast members to be involved in the British Empire podcast?
I hope so. I hope so. Yeah, that's what we'd love to do that. I mean, a lot of the cast have been on other podcasts, and they did a fantastic reunion a couple of years ago for the 30th anniversary. It was a Comic-Con company that put on to get a Zoom. I think it was a Zoom reunion with the cast. And they did a read through and answered questions. So I hope so. That's certainly a plan.
And why do you reckon that the British Empire is becoming even more popular than it was over this year?
I think anything that's good and anything that has a quality that makes it timeless, even if the availability is sporadic, whether it's on DVD, if it's not repeated very often, or in the case of today, obviously streaming, when they do have moments where they come back for they've been able to clear rights for or whatever it is, or whatever the reason they can't be on for continuously. I think that things that are good just come back and resonate all over again. I remember watching an interview with Chris Barry, who's plays the main character Gordon Britters, who is probably better known for Arnold Rimmer in Red Dwarf, and he's done conventions since the 90s, mainly for Red Dwarf. And I remember watching an interview with him in 2017 where he said that he was beginning to notice that more people were actually asking him questions about the British Empire. And I think the show is just so well made, and he's got so much more depth and a real human. Again, going back to what I said about 2.4 children, there's the wacky, surreal humor, but it's a real humanity and realism to the relationships and to the workplace culture that still resonates today. And I think, and also there's been more repeats on the now defunct Forces TV. Drama have had it on. BritBox has put the first 5 series, because there is only 5 series. Well, it's 5 what people say. There's no such thing. 6 and 7 don't exist. And I think that it's just because it's been more available and still very good that people are still enjoying it.
Yeah. And do you reckon that that the British Empire would work as a reboot, as it's been rumoured to be and coming back and then just dying off, then coming back, then dying off?
Do you mean about the reboot that they wanted, that there's
Well,
been
if they
rumors
were going to do
about?
a reboot now, do you reckon it'd still work?
I think a special would be very good. A full series is always a risk. I think the leisure centre setting probably has had its time. I think they're not saying that it wouldn't work in the leisure centre, but I don't know what more they could do. I think the British Empire is an empire. It could be any setting. I think in one way I'm intrigued. A few years ago, I was definitely very more intrigued, more enthusiastic about it than I possibly am now, actually. A part of me feels like it might be a Christmas special might be good, or maybe it's just best to leave it.
Yeah,
I don't know why. I just think reboots are very difficult. For all you can make a really great Cold Feet was very good.
yeah,
I didn't expect it to be as good. You've got an Arrested Development.
yeah.
So it's look at the draw. I think it won't. I think we've still got the best of it. We don't need any more, I don't think.
And what has been the most interesting part of your research and development for writing your 2.4 children book?
It's been how missed Gary Olsen still is.
Yeah,
So for people who don't know, obviously, the dad character was Ben Porter was played by Gary Olsen, very, very good actor who very sadly died only 9 or 10 months after they filmed the final series. He had was diagnosed with cancer, went to Australia because that's where his wife was from, and he passed away there, and that effectively ended the series. I think what's moved me most about everyone who's talked about him is, he passed away 23 years ago.
yeah,
You know, whole lifetime, for some people's whole childhood, and yet he is still so loved by everyone who knew him. It showed me how special a human being he must have been for people to still miss him. I mean, he was only 42. He'd be 66
yeah,
soon. No age to go. My dad's 66, and it's just it's just. And I know some people make their 50, 60. He just went far too young. It was very, very
yeah,
one of those things where life is unfortunately very, very cruel sometimes. And I think that's what's moved me most.
yeah,
I think in terms of there's some really good stories, some great trivia. I'm not going to say now because I think I want people to be surprised and just, I want people to buy the book. I don't want to give too much away, but I think the thing I was most moved by is how much he is still loved. And I think it really shows what an interesting and special person he was.
yeah. And because of the evolution of the way we read, will there be an audio version as well, or are you just gonna leave that so that they can listen to the podcast for the sort of similar sort of feeling to it?
That's I don't know because I think a lot of these behind the scenes stories I might not be in the podcast. I will be releasing quite a lot of the actor interviews. I've released a couple already, but I'm saving a lot of the others for when the book comes out near the book because I don't want everything to be out there and people don't bother or not interested reading the book. I think the audiobook I could do an audiobook myself maybe put it on Spotify. Um, but I think for now, I don't know. I have no publisher for it. I'd like to take some publishers. And if it doesn't work out, I'll self-publish. I've done it before. I'd like a physical copy, some ebook, e-copies, um, audiobook maybe. I'm not too sure, but I would say that to get the full story, you have to read the book.
And do you find it easy, or do you find it slightly difficult to be able to just sit there and write and write and write?
It's finding the time, like anything, really. It's just having and I'm generally quite disciplined. As I say, recently I've not had the time to put like life admin, as it were, has taken over. But the hardest thing about it actually was the process of so you interview everyone, get it transcribed, and the problem with transcriptions is it doesn't always come out well.
Yeah,
Sometimes the spelling isn't right, sometimes the grammar and punctuation isn't right, sometimes words. So you have to take everything that you've done, that are relevant to relevant chapters and episodes, put them in the format, listen over them, tidy them up, then get critical reviews and put them in, making sure that the writing is correct and it's interesting, not using the same words twice in the sentence, all the basic stuff. I think it's been a fun project though, and therefore I just don't. It's not a chore to do because I'm so excited about it. It's just hoping that people will like it.
Yeah. And who is your at the moment? Who's your favorite character to write about? Like from 2.4, from any series of 2.4 children, which one's the most fun to write notes about, write chapters about?
Well, it's not so much the character. I've structured it into the point where we talk about the origins of 2.4 children and how Andrew Marshall came up with the idea. Then there's about the pilot, which was filmed at Pebble Mill Studios in Birmingham before it went to the studio centre in television centre in London. And so, in those origins, yeah, we talk a bit about the characters, where they came from, where he came up with the ideas, and then how the actors were cast in it, and then it goes from chapter to chapter as the series, and so we developed and it's just going behind the scenes and trivia for every episode. So there's not really a character that I particularly enjoyed writing about in the book because they're all written in the same kind of way, if you know what I mean. Because I have to write about them all as equally as each other, about where they came from and how the performances were developed. I think my favorite character is Bill. I think she's one of the most underrated female characters, let alone characters in a sitcom. I've never seen a character like her in anything before or since. I think characters that are like her in sitcom since are a bit less vulnerable than she is. I like how she's not perfect, but she's a very strong character. I think they he got that right, Andrew Marshall, in terms of making her real. But I think the thing I've enjoyed the most about the book is structuring all the episodes and just putting it all together and seeing it come together so that it flows so well enough so that it makes sense. Everything's in there, and hopefully people will find it entertaining.
Yeah. And do you think that 2.4 children would have ran as long as My Family did if Gary Olsen hadn't have sadly passed away?
I think, yeah, it would have. I know for a fact that they would want to do more of it. That was always they knew they probably knew well in the beginning that after they finished the final series, that we'll probably be back here next year doing it. And then sadly Gary got ill and passed away. So yeah, it would have. I think it could have easily gone on a couple more years, easily beyond 10 series. Certainly it was still fresh by the end. I mean, it was not My Family. It was fresher by the eighth series of 2.4 Children was fresher than My Family was by the fourth. So, and that went for 11 series. So, yeah, I think definitely had a lot more legs for sure.
And do you reckon without the ending of My Family, do you reckon that My Parents Were Aliens wouldn't have happened? Because in the final series, I don't know the actor's name, sadly,
Mm.
but they've got the child that plays Josh in My Parents Were Aliens. Do you reckon My Parents Were Aliens wouldn't have happened if, as well, wouldn't have been as popular if My Family hadn't have ended?
Do you mean 2.4
I
Children
mean,
had ended?
2.4 children.
I know. Yeah. I he was doing it simultaneously. Alex Q, the actor who played Declan, who was the boy that the Porters adopt or in the process of adopting in the final series, he was doing My Parents Are Aliens. I think it was before 2.4 or simultaneously. I think they probably would have managed the schedule, I imagine, or found a way to make it both work because I think that but by the last episode season officially adopted by them, so he would have been a main key player throughout the rest of the run if they carried on.
Yeah. And do you reckon that sitcoms work as well when they have a cast member change, but they keep the same character? Do you reckon shows like that still work as well as they do when they began and became popular?
Well, I mean, there's great examples of both ways where it can and can't work, really. I mean, in the case of 2.4, they had quite a few cast changes. The most notable one is, of course, that they changed the cast, the actress playing the daughter, Jenny. So the original actress, Claire Woodgate, brilliant. You know, she played the character in the first two seasons quite grumpy and a bit of had that goth element, and she's a very good actress. And then she left the series, and so I think when they brought in Claire Buckfield in the third series and she stayed for the rest of it, I think it was early enough on so that the show was still early in its run and it's still finding its feet create. I mean, I think it's great from the beginning, but it's still finding its feet creatively, and its audience to build. So that I think a shift like that isn't quite as jolting as say something like Goodnight Sweetheart,
Yeah.
which I mean I find it very odd now looking at that because so Goodnight Sweetheart's another brilliant early 90s sitcom. Nicholas Lyndhurst, he played a man who in the 90s who can go back in time to the Second World War and has two alternating lives. He has a girlfriend in 1990s and then eventually a girlfriend in the 40s, and he's basically two timing. It's very, very, very good show. And the actresses, both actresses actually changed halfway through the series. So there were 6 series of Goodnight Sweetheart. The first 3 series had two actresses playing those characters, and then the second half of the series, 4, 5, and 6, they changed. The actresses changed. I think for different. I don't know the full detail about, but for different reasons they got different actors in, and that's more jolting.
Yeah.
Red did it as well. They had 4 successful series, and then the main character and another cast member changed, two of the probably most popular characters, and certainly one of them, the main character, and that was more jolting. So I think for me, it's one of those where it can work. Probably the earlier in a series run, the better.
Yeah.
But then again, but in both the case I've just given, it was jolting, but people still adapted to it. So it just depends really.
And as we're coming into the towards the slippery slopes of the end of the interview, do you think that because of the way that TV works now, do you reckon that studio sitcoms aren't as well loved for newer audiences to be able to get enough funding to make new ones, or do you reckon that they're as loved as they were before the non-studio sitcoms came into play?
I think they're just not making them, so it's hard to answer really. Um, I Me and Chris talk about this all the time on the British podcast and sometimes and in private as well. The thing about it for me that I like about 2.4 Children and British Empire, and I think a lot of those early 90s sitcoms prove Fools and Horses. I know it started in the 80s, but it was still big and good in the early 90s. That Vicar of Dibley, Keeping Up Appearances, One Foot in the Grave. The one thing I think that those sitcoms achieved in the studio-based setting was pace. In those sitcoms, you were allowed to breathe. You didn't have to have a laugh every second. Characters were allowed to say things that weren't necessarily going to come a gag all the time. You believed in the world. I think that the old aspect ratio helped because the studio sets looked real because there's the graininess. As soon as it went to digital and HD, they looked like sets. Like Mrs. Brown's Boys does not look like a real house. Let's be honest. And from my perspective, it doesn't. I think there was an evolution that needed to happen, and the royal family and the office brought that in. Studio sitcoms for me went down the hill very quickly in the 2000s. I think things like My Family and The Green Grass, I feel that they made serious sitcoms a little bit more obvious, a little bit played to the lowest common denominator, to be honest. In a way, I felt like the 90s was really getting somewhere and it was evolving it, and then it sort of went back to a bygone era in the 2000s and the 2010s. I just wish there was more comedies in general. I crave, I love Ghosts, Motherland, and Two Doors Down is great. But I do crave a half-8 BBC One studio-based sitcom that everyone can watch. I mean, Ghost is probably the only show that's quite close to being a prime-time family-friendly show where something for everyone in it. A lot of people say they don't like studio-based sitcoms, but they watch Friends. They'll watch Friends. They'll watch Only Fools and Horses, and new generations will watch them.
Yeah.
I just think we're in a weird time with comedy and humor in general, I think. Um, I just wish they were making them because we need a laugh, but seemingly in a world where we're not allowed to. So I think to answer your question is I think if they made more studio sitcoms, I'm sure people would watch them, but they need to make good studio sitcoms. The last one I liked was Miranda, to be honest. I quite enjoyed early Mrs. Brown's Boys, but I think that's just a dead horse that they're flogging and flogging and flogging and flogging beyond its natural life.
Yeah,
We'll see. We'll see what the future holds. I think if they had a balance, if they really invested in it, I'm sure that they'd have some classics
yeah.
for the future.
Yeah, and with Mrs. Brown's Boys, what they did is it didn't start out as a studio-based sitcom, so it started out on radio, then had some books, then had one TV series in Ireland, then
Yeah.
which was called Mrs. Brown Boys. Then they did a sequel series called Mrs. Brown. Then they did a
Yes.
film, and then they turned into the BBC One sitcom. So Peter Kay was in Mrs. Brown, and not in the film, but in the TV series, but in the film was played by a different woman. It was a completely different cast in the film than it is in the series.
Wow, I did not know Peter Kay played Mrs. Brown.
No, he didn't. He didn't play Mrs. Brown. He was just in it as a shopkeeper.
Oh, was this in the Irish version?
Yeah. So if you're on go on YouTube and search up Mrs. Brown and watch the intro, because that's the only thing that exists in that version, you can see him waving because he does a very good Irish accent when he's on stage.
I did not know that. Wow, was this before he was famous?
Uh, No, he was at the well. It was when he was in. It was when he was in the early days of his fame, when he was just on a few TV shows before he started creating them. When he was very young and small.
Interesting. Wow, I'm going to look at that.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
And so we come to the point in the interview where you can now tell us where people can find you. Don't give away your home address, but where can people find you online?
Don't currently have a home address, to be honest. That's the thing. I am safe from stalkers then, which is good. You can find me at JD Collins Writer on Instagram, JD Collins 95 on Twitter or X or whatever Elon Musk is calling it today. And then you can find the 2.4 Children podcast page at 2.4 Podcast on Twitter and on Instagram. There's a 2.4 Children DVD and streaming campaign page on Facebook. And there is a British Empire fan page called at British Fan, which is on Instagram and Twitter, X, that a lovely lady called Louise runs, and she promotes our podcast. And you can also find the British Empire Appreciation Society on Facebook.
There we go. Thank you for letting me interview you.
Well, thank you for having me on again, Tom, and thank you for giving 2.4 Children a bit of loving because it deserves it.
Yes. And there we have it, another wonderful interview. Now, if you want to see more interviews by me, always stay tuned in the Tom Mason universe, and always stay tuned for more nonsense. And I've never mentioned this before, but whilst I've got my lovely guest on, I have also featured on his podcast, and Tom's No More Jockeys sadly closed its I don't know what the horse racing term is, but it's doors to welcome,
Stables.
yes, close its stables to welcome brand new ideas and brand new illusions to the universe of Tom Mason Tries Comedy. So, thank you guys for watching, and remember, no, I've forgotten.